So food security is a moral imperative, but it's also an economic imperative. History teaches us that one of the most effective ways to pull people and entire nations out of poverty is to invest in their agriculture.
Make it easier for us to do business, they tell us, for our entrepreneurs, for our farmers.
In my travels, how increased investments in agriculture and nutrition are paying off in rising prosperity, healthier children, better markets, and stronger communities.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We had a really exciting day yesterday, I think. I know I enjoyed it. We heard so many different perspectives over the course of the day. And now we're gathered back together in a different format. And one of the things this format allows us to do is maybe to interact a little more with our neighbors since we're around tables. And so I'd like to just pause for a moment and ask you to introduce yourselves, if you haven't done that already, to the people at your table. Okay. And maybe I should have said briefly introduce yourselves. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, eminences, ministers, ambassadors, mission directors. So yesterday was really a good foundation for our discussions because we heard about the origins of Feed the Future. We heard about the multi-agency nature of the initiative, about the focus on country partnership, and heard views from the field. And we heard about the ways we're all working together around the fight against a common challenge of global food insecurity, hunger, undernutrition, and poverty, and a common set of goals for progress in solving those problems. But rather than me trying to summarize yesterday's conversations and presentations, I wanted to turn to a couple of colleagues to share their impressions of how it went. So I'd like to turn first to Rob Bertram, who heads the USAID Bureau for Food Security's Office of Agriculture Research and Policy. Can we get a mic to Rob? Rob, or just belt it out? Here we go.
Try that. But thanks, Jonathan. Well, to me, yesterday gave us a sense for where Feed the Future had come from and where it is going. And I thought there were some important surprises mixed in there. And I'll try to flag some of those. I think the administrator reminded us that Feed the Future came out of conflict, actually, and upheaval associated with food price rises, and underscored the fact that food isn't just about human well-being, it's about societal well-being. And that Gebisa Ejeta then picked up on that same theme and really tied us way back to the Point 4 context in 1949. And he said, we can't, echoing the words of that time, we can't afford indifference. Peace, stability, and economic growth for poor countries matters. and he underscored that this is really enlightened self-interest for the United States. He underscored the role of an FTF of deliberate partnerships, of consultation that helps deliver those partnerships, and on engaging people as the only real way to change the world. He spoke about science and technology in terms of problem solving and what he called purpose-driven research. And he talked about the importance of developing input delivery systems. He said those have been foundational in American rural development and that they would be so elsewhere as well. I thought Senator Lugar brought a real note of optimism to the meeting when he talked about the fact that we can do it, but he emphasized governance, conflict, and gender. And he praised our focus on smallholders, access to technology, credit, and extension. He talked about the complexity requiring efficiency and transparency. And I thought very interestingly, he said that combating corruption was going to be a key aspect of U.S. leadership. Schengen Fan then said something also really important, I thought, and that was that he said $1 invested towards stunting reduction gives a $30 return in terms of outcomes. And I think what this says to us is that including nutrition in Feed the Future is not just a moral thing, it's a smart thing to do. So that was, I thought, very exciting. He talked about the progress we've made in terms of investment, trade plans, and stocks, but he said we're lagging on things like climate resilience and social protection. He also, I think, pointed out very interestingly that resilience was going to be critical to ending hunger. Ending hunger was the word he used by 2025. Then later in the day, we got more into the operational nitty-gritty. Jonathan, you picked up on some of this already. The local ownership, the partnerships with civil society, including the private sector, the role of policy. We heard about how Senegal and Liberia had both made important policy decisions related to Feed the Future. We heard that it's not just about economic growth, it's about inclusive economic growth that reaches the poor. And it's not just about food production, it's about consumption as well. We heard a lot about youth, how agriculture has an aging workforce. And no agriculture, no work. That came from one of the African representatives. Young people are critical, and I quote this, we need to unlock the land, we need to offer new entrant opportunities, and we need to connect those efforts to value chains. We heard again that U.S. leadership was critical. The African leaders talked about our convening power. We heard that on the gender front, we were making great progress, that we were really out front in many respects, and that there are many points of entry, government, business, policy. We also heard that it's not just about women, that going forward, gender is about the role of men as well. Finally, I wanted to just sort of credit my colleague, Shauna Gillette, who shared an overall impression of the day that I thought was kind of nice. She said, just listening to the day's event, she said, Feed the Future is an integrated partnership approach that is messy, challenging, sometimes discouraging, but in the end, worthwhile because it makes connections across sectors that result in more efficient, inclusive, holistic approaches to development and can lead to fundamental change. And that's just what PEPFAR has managed to do, and she highlighted that as well. So those were some of my impressions from the day.
And I'm glad you passed the microphone to our colleague from Peace Corps, Sarah Lopez, who's going to share her impressions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. I won't go into as much detail as Rob did since he gave such an excellent summary of what we covered yesterday, but I did want to just give you kind of my key takeaways or impressions and let you know that yesterday at the end of the day, I think everyone knows we have 3 of our Feed the Future Peace Corps volunteers with us at this table back there. So I wanted to hear kind of what they thought coming from, their villages in Africa and flying all the way over here to participate in this conference. And what they were struck by was really seeing the depth and breadth of Feed the Future and recognizing how many different players there are from the U.S. government level all the way down to the household level and seeing how everybody works together in partnership. And they were really impressed by all of the different activities that Feed the Future is accomplishing, from fish farming in Bangladesh to what Rakeen spoke about yesterday when he gave the presentation on digital green, where they're using technology to videotape and train and get feedback from communities. And so I thought that it was important to see all of the different levels at which Feed the Future works. And I'm not sure if everybody was here for the closing, but our Feed the Future Peace Corps volunteer, Stevie, gave a really great portrayal of a day in the life of her host mother. And she said, you know, she makes me be a better person because she gets up at 4 a.m. and does all of this for the family. So I like those perspectives because it does help everybody remember, you know, what Feed the Future is all about. And then the second takeaway that I had was one of the panelists yesterday mentioned how important it is to recognize if something's not going right, if a program isn't going right, if we're not getting the results that we'd anticipated, so that we can make adjustments and then improve upon them. And I think that's something that we should always keep in mind, because if we don't recognize where something's not working and we don't share information amongst everybody, I mean, there's 300 people here. Feed the Future is huge, and we can all learn from each other's mistakes. And so I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, that as we're moving forward, not everything's going to work well, and if we recognize it and make improvements, then in the end we will have a much better program.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for recognizing that we all make mistakes. But it's really what we do with those, and that really is the approach that's embedded in Feed the Future, is to learn from our progress, whether it's forward or backward, by measuring what we do and utilizing the evidence from our experiences to move forward. And so we really did have an exciting day yesterday. I know some of you were here for a reception here at the conference site. Some of us were up on Capitol Hill for an additional piece of the program, which was a reception that celebrated a few things. One was we heard from no less than 7 members of Congress from both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and from both parties, speaking about the value they attach to the U.S. fight against global hunger and undernutrition, and their continued dedication, including from Chairwoman Nita Lowey, to continuing to make sure that resources are available for that fight. And that was critically important. We also saw the signing of a memorandum of understanding between Interaction on behalf of its many member organizations, non-governmental organizations from the United States, to work with USAID to align efforts in the field as we work together in the fight against hunger. And this is buoyed by the increased pledge from Interaction on behalf of its member organizations, which was originally a $1 billion pledge for work on global hunger and food security, and it's been upped to a $1.5 billion pledge. And this is private, non-government resources being devoted over a 3-year period to global food security and nutrition. And in addition, last night at this same reception, we also saw the release of the Feed the Future Civil Society Action Plan, which we're going to hear about a little bit more later. And this was developed with input from many of you from both the government side and the civil society side. And it really does remind us that we need partners. We need partners in different parts of the U.S. government, executive branch, legislative branch, different agencies. We need partnerships with other governments and international institutions. We need partnerships with private sector partners and civil society partners in order to achieve the kind of collective effort, the collective action that is really needed to make a difference in the fight against hunger and undernutrition and poverty around the world. Today we're going to go through a couple of presentations that will help sharpen our focus on this. We're going to have plenary sessions for a bit. Then we're going to have a session at lunchtime, which will be an Ask the Leadership session with USAID Bureau for Food Security Leadership to be able to be here on stage so that members of the audience can ask questions and directly engage them. We're also going to have breakout sessions in the afternoon on key themes that many of you have identified in the lead up to this forum, so that you'll be able to drill down into the issues that interest you. I'll go over some of those topics later in the program. And then on Wednesday, we're going to have a lunch session that will offer the opportunity to form interest groups where people can pick out different topics that have emerged in the discussion. So for example, yesterday we heard questions about how to address concerns about genetically modified organisms as a sometimes controversial topic that some in the effort have found challenging to deal with. And so there might be, for example, an interest group formed around a discussion on that topic. And there is a sheet in your folders that allows you to identify an area of interest that you might want to see an interest group formed around, so that we can help organize those sessions for tomorrow's lunch. What else? A moment ago, I mentioned direct engagement with civil society, and that we would be hearing more about the Civil Society Action Plan. And to help us in that, we are joined today by Reverend David Beckmann. David is the head of Bread for the World. And I first met David when it must have been about 2005 or 2006 in a smaller meeting room at the top of the State Department, where Reverend Beckmann was part of a team of faith-based leaders who were coming together to sit down with then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to advocate for progress, not in direct development assistance programs where you might have said that makes sense, but to advocate for progress in the multilateral trade negotiations going on through the WTO. And it was to bring this perspective that progress in trade policy, in that case, matters for development and matters for the concerns of the poor and our hope to be able to address those concerns. I didn't see David for a couple of years after that. Didn't really get the chance to work together with him, but in the meantime he managed to pick up a World Food Prize for his leadership of an advocacy organization demonstrating, where the World Food Prize Foundation was interested in demonstrating that advocacy is an important element of progress in feeding the world. And he's also, he's been playing this leadership role in Bread for the World for over 20 years, and he's a true champion of the effort to reduce hunger and undernutrition around the world, and he hasn't been shy about offering advice and recommendations to the US government. This was true, as I mentioned, on trade policy in that session with then Secretary Rice. It has been true in the build-up to the establishment of Feed the Future, when Bread for the World and Reverend Beckmann were regular sources of counsel and advice. And then as we designed the initiative, the engagement continued. And that advice that we so value from the advocacy community continued with greater intensity over the course of last summer. Some of you may remember that yesterday I mentioned we did an event in New York in the fall of 2012 around the theme of civil society and its relationship to the fight against hunger, undernutrition, and poverty. And coming out of that event, then Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton announced that we would be developing a Feed the Future civil society action plan. But we figured we needed some more advice from civil society as we looked forward to that. And so several months later, Administrator Shah of USAID used one of the tools that is at his disposal, which is the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Assistance, or ACFA, which is only slightly more pronounceable than GAFSP, to ask ACFA to establish a working group to advise USAID and the Feed the Future interagency collection of agencies in the US government on how we could better interact with civil society at home and abroad to strengthen our efforts in the fight against hunger, poverty, and undernutrition. It was very easy, I think, to pick out leaders for that working group. So the ACFA leadership, that is the private civil society organizations, came together and identified David Beckmann from Bread for the World, and Bruce McNamara, who was then president of TechnoServe, which many of the USAID folks here and some of the others will recognize as a key partner in the field. And that touched off a very intensive series of deliberations and consultations, which Jada McKenna and I were really we found a great deal of value in spending time on over the course of last summer. Many hours of meetings, conference calls with a couple of AID missions so that we could hear the field perspective. And the result of that was a very powerful set of recommendations which this ACFA working group delivered to Administrator Shah last fall that included recommendations for ways of improving Feed the Future's engagement with civil society in the field. And there were a number of detailed recommendations there, and also looking for ways to strengthen our collaboration with civil society representatives in the United States to get out the message. And that's an area, that second area, where I know that David Beckmann will have something to say, but the results of that shared effort to get out the word were demonstrated last night when we had these 7 members of Congress getting up to talk about their devotion, their dedication to the fight against hunger. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to David Beckmann. Thank you.
Thanks to Jonathan, and thanks to all of you. This is a room full of leaders in what the world is doing to reduce hunger. And so I am just thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you. Bread for the World organizes advocacy mainly with the U.S. Congress. And so what I'd like to do is talk about 3 advocacy tasks that we need to be involved in together, and then just briefly talk about God and how all this relates to God. I find it just tremendously exciting to see what our country has been able to do over the last 5 years to support progress against world hunger. This did begin in 2008 when there was a surge in basic grain prices coupled with the financial crisis. And so you had a lot more people, nobody knows how many, but maybe as many as 200 million more people were driven into hunger. And when the Obama administration came to office, you may remember they had quite a few things to deal with, but they focused also on this world hunger crisis. They moved really quickly using the World Bank to support what the affected countries were trying to do. And then in 2009, at President Obama's first G8 summit, he came with a commitment to increase U.S. investment in agriculture in low-income developing countries. And even more importantly, he mobilized the whole G8 for a much larger global commitment of support to low-income developing countries that were trying to do the right thing. The U.S. part of this global effort has really been extraordinarily effective. From the very beginning, Secretary Clinton and Raj Shah were clear that this wasn't just going to be the government, but that we were going to try to mobilize our whole society. And so right at the start, there were meetings with business leaders, lots of meetings with NGOs, so that to try to engage our whole society in supporting a reversal of the increase in hunger that had taken place. The Civil Society Action Plan that was released last night is a really good plan. And Jonathan and Jada had much more patience with civil society than I did. You know, listening to civil society takes time, and they did it, but the result was a higher quality plan for how we are together going to move forward. This week, the administration will also release AID's new nutrition strategy. I am really excited about that because we know better how to reduce malnutrition among kids than we did just a few years ago. And so in this nutrition strategy, the US government is looking at an array of ongoing programs to figure out how to use those resources to do more to reduce the scourge of child malnutrition. What's happened is that spike in world hunger, in fact, has come down, and that the world has resumed its progress toward the end of hunger. Now, I don't think Americans know about this. A lot of people know that our country played a leadership role in bringing the AIDS pandemic under some kind of control. But people do not know that our country has helped to reduce world hunger. Congress has funded this program on a bipartisan basis, but they will not maintain the funding. They will certainly not increase the funding as they should, unless all of us find ways to work together to tell the American people that we have done something that we can feel really good about ourselves for. We've helped to reduce world hunger. Now, a second advocacy task is even more urgent, and that has to do with food aid reform. I think everybody in this room knows that U.S. food aid does a great deal of good in the world. But we also know that this program could be much more effective. It is not smart, it is not up to date to require that all the food be shipped from the U.S. to the other side of the world. And it is certainly not smart to require that it be shipped by those few shipping companies that are U.S. flag carriers. They are less efficient, more expensive than other shipping companies. President Bush started the process of trying to reform U.S. food aid. President Obama has proposed more ambitious reforms. In last year's Farm Bill debate in the House, we came very close to getting House approval for the Royce-Engels Amendment, a bipartisan amendment that would have gone further than President Obama's proposal to make food aid more effective, more efficient, more up-to-date. But then this year, we failed by 2 or 3 votes. But then this year, the shipping companies have pushed back. So we got some additional flexibility in the Farm Bill. But then in other legislation, Congress decided to increase payments to this handful of shipping companies. And to take that money from food for hungry people. So net this year, Farm Bill and this other legislation, we have lost food for 1.4 million desperate people every year going forward. I find this I'm a pretty moderate guy, but this is outrageous. This is just outrageous. And then 2 weeks ago, the House passed a Coast Guard bill that would further increase the subsidies to those same shipping companies, and it would reduce the reach of U.S. food assistance by another 2 million people a year. Whether you work on food aid or not, we have got to stop this. This is a room full of people who know how to work Congress. Anybody who lives in this country can call your senator, and you will make a difference. But some of you have personal contacts in those offices. The immediate thing is that the Senate needs to stop the House Coast Guard bill. But then we've got to push back. And so we need to tell our senators and our members of the House that we want them to pass reform along the line of what the president's asked for or what Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engels asked for. This is doable, it's winnable, and we've got to win it. Let me make one other advocacy point. I'll come around on the outside maybe. This is a longer-term challenge, but it is even more ambitious. I think we should try to make hunger and poverty a national priority for the United States. We can all be really encouraged by the fact that the world as a whole has made dramatic progress against hunger, poverty, and disease. And it's happening in all kinds of countries. Countries as different as Bangladesh and Mozambique or Brazil. Great Britain has reduced child poverty. So we know that with some effort, we can virtually end extreme poverty and hunger by 2030. Now, U.S. leadership really is crucial. Political leadership everywhere is the bottleneck, but political leadership in this country is especially important. And I think we're not going to get our country to do a whole lot more to provide opportunity for people all over the world unless we can also get our country to do more to provide opportunity for people who are struggling in our own communities. In 2008, the number of people in this country who are food insecure jumped by 40%. These are households that run out of food at the end of many months. It jumped by 40%, and we have not reversed the spike in hunger in America. Many American families, probably most American families, are still struggling in this economy. What encourages me is that politicians, Democrats and Republicans, are talking much more about poverty and opportunity than they have for decades. And so I think it's really possible to imagine that in January 2017, the next president of the United States is going to say it's time for us to get serious about hunger and poverty. We're going to have open primaries on both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, so we'll have a robust discussion about what our priorities are as a nation are, and we can get to the point where hunger and poverty is important to both the President and Congress of the United States in 2017, so that then the two parties are just talking about how to get it done, how best to get it done, not whether to pay attention to people who are hungry and poor. And our people are generous, they're idealistic, so if we can get back to a point where Americans feel that this is a land of opportunity for Americans, then I think Americans will also support leadership by our country in making this a world of opportunity for everybody. Now, God. I believe in God. And so, when I see hundreds of millions of people escaping from extreme poverty around the world, I think this is God. This is God. This is our loving God moving in our own time. And I think the fact that we can virtually end extreme poverty and hunger, this is God's invitations to all of us, to people all across this country, to people all around the world to get with the program. It is a great liberation. In my mind, it's an exodus, something like the Exodus, much, much bigger, and God's inviting us to be part of this exodus from hunger.